Deuteronomy chapters 26 to 28 today. Quite a short section, but there's some really big ideas to get stuck into. It starts off with another reference to tithing. That's giving 10% of everything you earn in a year to basically donate it to God as a sacrificial sort of thing, I suppose. It's done in this instance with the form of a sort of like a prayer as well. And it's actually quite nice in the sense of God's done all this wonderful stuff for you, you're giving this, and it's a nice sort of ceremonial ritual of gratitude, as it were, which has a positive vibe to it. I actually this week encountered a modern instance of tithing. One of my colleagues at work is helping a prospective new client who's very young, but earning a lot of money, and she's giving away 10% of her money to her local church. It's remarkable that's still a thing. I actually had a quick look at the Church of England's finances, and they're sitting on something like 10 billion of assets that are generating something like 10% a year, which is basically huge in investment terms. And most of their annual expenditure is funded by donations and tithes. So it's clearly a prolific thing in terms of people gifting to the church. It's a difficult one in the sense that it's close to being a beautiful thing, and the idea behind it, obviously, you're giving away 10% of your income to an organisation that's designed to help people, and all the rest of it. But also, you can't help but, well, on the other side, there's a whiff of scam about it, and the church is generating more than it's spending by the looks of it. It's limited information, but from what I can see, it looks like it's generating more, so it's growing in that respect. And you can't help but there were a whiff of guilt about it as well, people doing it because they feel guilty in terms of what they've got. So there's potential for an extreme positive on one side and potential for quite an ugly negative on the other. I'm not quite sure what to do with it, but if it were all true, then it's obviously, I guess it's the former. If it's not true, it's kind of the latter, and it's a difficult one. We'll keep an eye anyway, but interesting. There's a big song and dance made about a bit where the leaders of each of the Israelite tribes are going to call out to the crowd a curse on a bunch of bad things that God doesn't like. I assume this was going to be the Ten Commandments, basically in reverse. There's a curse on this behaviour, a curse on that behaviour. But there's 12 of them. And there's some interesting examples in. One of them is a curse on anyone who takes a bribe to secretly murder someone. Yeah, fair enough. But it's delightfully random, isn't it? Very specifically random, if that's not a contradiction. There's another curse that would have caught Abraham out because he was married to his half-sister. So it seemed to very clearly distinguish that the rules are evolving over time, because Abraham, being this wonderful righteous man at one point, he would now have a curse on him at this point. So I guess either it's an inconsistency in the Bible or it's evolution of rules. The evolution thing seems to make sense to me. And then, of course, another curse on anyone who thinks it's a good idea to go to bed with their donkey. Sort of fair enough, I suppose. We then come on to this interesting section about what you get if you get it right and what you get if you get it wrong. And this is obviously a repetition from what we've looked at before, but it expands. There's some useful context. Basically, it's if you do as God tells you, you're going to get the basics of life. Your fields will grow crops, you will be able to deliver children, you'll be protected from your enemies. There's an interesting bit about you will be blessed on the way in and on the way out, but with no context as to what a way in and out of what. And I wondered if that was life, as in birth and death. And so we've still had nothing really on any afterlife. There's been a couple of cryptic nods. This may be a cryptic nod to that, it might not. So they're that cryptic anyway, that there's certainly nothing overtly said about any afterlife. But it's interesting, we'll keep an eye. There was an interesting bit in this, though, I noticed, that whilst I was reading what's going to happen to you that's bad if you don't follow God's rules, I was reading it for quite a long time. Whereas the positive bit, I wasn't reading for quite such a long time. So I thought I'd just check what is the difference in length. The positive section is chapter 28, verses 1 to 13, so 13 verses long. The negative part goes from chapter 28, verse 15 to 68. So 54 verses long for the negative, verses 13 for the positive, so just over 4 times longer. And I don't know, something about that feels very... I mean, I guess you can't argue if you go under a bus and you come to the pearly gates, and it's like, I did tell you what was going to happen. No one's ever going to be able to argue that God didn't make abundantly clear 4 times greater length what the consequences were going to be. So, ignorance is not a defence in that respect, assuming you read the Bible, obviously. It does, though, have a whiff of threat about it, though, doesn't it? In the sense that it almost makes it sound like any misfortune or hardship that befalls you, or sickness even, is as a result of sin. I really don't like that idea, I have to say. Basically because I've known some really wonderful people who've had some really terrible things happen to them. Not least including 2 vicars who've suffered with cancer and died. And it would be a hard argument to make that they died because of their sin. And it's kind of, both people who dedicated their lives to helping other people. And they end up with that. So something in that doesn't stack up anyway. It also has a bit of a whiff of threat about it, in the sense you do as you're told, you get some basics, stuff will grow, it will rain a bit, and basic stuff like that. Whereas get it wrong, and there's this massive tirade of what's going to happen to you if you do it wrong. I don't know, it's difficult to not see that as a bit of a threat. It's odd as well. If you've ever seen the movie A Knight's Tale, Alan Tudyk's, I hope I'm saying that right, sorry if I'm not Alan, character in that, gets very, very angry, but manages to contain it. But you can see the effort he's going to contain his own anger when he's explaining what's going to happen to people if they do something wrong. And it feels a lot like that almost. And I suppose, to be fair, this speech is coming from Moses rather than God. So there's something in that potentially. It's not actually God saying it, it's Moses saying it. But then it is Moses saying it on God's behalf, because it does seem he is a prophet, and therefore what he is saying God is backing up. But yeah, I think to some extent it feels like it's metaphorical, or metaphorically exaggerated. Is that a thing? It's a thing now. I'm conscious of letting it off by reading too much into it. But it does seem, it's slightly ludicrous if you actually read it. It's talking to the extent that a mother's going to be so miserable because of their lives being terrible, they're going to secretly intend to eat their own children, and God is going to take great pleasure in destruction and ruin of the Israelites and stuff. And given it's Moses saying as well, perhaps there's some embellishment. Embellishment does definitely seem to be a thing at this point in terms of how people talk. Going back to that idea of God talking about people brought on the wings of eagles, and it's like, well, they weren't, were they? So that's not literally true. So this, I guess, potentially metaphorically making a point. And I guess in that respect, as I said before, I'm very positive on life and optimistic and all the rest of it. But I do accept that if you don't do stuff in life, it's pretty hostile. It's not going to take long for some pretty bad stuff to happen to you, and that may happen anyway. But unless you get off your butt and go and do positive things and live a right way in some sort of sense, however you define that, that bad stuff is going to start to befall you, and it's going to get pretty ugly. So yeah, I think a lot of care needs to be taken not to overread into it. But it would make sense in that sense, I think, and that would line up with how life works to some extent, albeit not necessarily on a spiritual, in terms of God kind of way. But yeah, I'm not sure on that. We'll have to keep an eye and see how it goes, and onwards we'll go to the next one.